Doing some painting?
Yeah.
When we left off, I'd built, prepared and primed the 35th scale Meng Leopard 2, and in this video I'll be taking you through the steps I took to take the model from this to this. G'day guys, I'm Clayton and this is Workbench Hobbies. Welcome back to the channel and thanks so much for helping me grow this community. As mentioned in the previous video, planning to paint a scheme like this is really important, and the flatter I could keep the surfaces I was planning to mask, the better the chance of achieving a satisfactory result. When planning the masking and colour order, I decided the best way to go about this would be to spray the white initially, then the khaki drab, and then finally the sand colour. I chose that order mainly because the first two colours of the scheme would be the easier to create the shapes and actually allow me to apply the masks in an efficient way. White was the first layer that was applied. Now, white is generally quite a weak paint in terms of coverage, so to achieve a bright white usually requires multiple layers. I didn't, however, want my white to be too bright, so by applying this layer over the Mr. Surfacer Grey, I was able to tone the brightness down by simply limiting the coverage of the paint. The semi-translucent properties of the thinned white paint meant I was able to apply the paint over the grey in an imperfect way to create a mottled tone to the white and add some visual depth to the layer. The scheme I'd chosen to generally follow is the scheme that's included in the Vespid Model's 72nd scale release of this version of the Leopard 2. My background in the signage and graphics industry really gives me a leg up here, and I'm firstly able to print the Vespid suggested scheme on an A3 piece of paper for reference. I'm then able to create myself a paint mask set by redrawing the shapes in Adobe Illustrator and then producing a template through my digital printer. With all of the basic shapes set out on my mask set, it was now a matter of beginning the masking process. Following the placement of the positions as best I could using the printout as my reference. Because a lot of the underside shapes are obscured in the color plate I was following, I was unable to create those shapes digitally. So it was back to the old school masking method with a wide piece of Tamiya tape.
Old school.
The masking of the white shapes moves to the hull section now, and most of the positions are easily identified from the printout. However, after looking at reference midway through the build, I did realise I'd missed some of the shapes on this front section, and that would need to be addressed later in the build. With the masking of the white shapes complete, it was now time to spray the khaki drab. It's suggested that the khaki drab should be mixed with an olive green to achieve the ideal colour. I however felt the straight khaki drab was a pretty good match to what I was hoping to see, and I chose to use that straight from the jar. It was thinned to about a 50-50 mix with Tamiya retarder thinner for the record. The initial coat of khaki drab is lightly applied and built up slowly. It's really important when masking and spraying not to flood the model with paint. Too much paint on the surface will want to bleed under your mask, or it can sometimes leave a lip on the edge of the paint once the mask is removed, and you want to avoid that as much as you can. It's also important to try and keep your spraying angle as close to 90 degrees to the surface that you are painting. Spraying at an angle like this can usually maintain your tight lines even if the masking tape is slightly lifting. The coverage doesn't need to be perfect, as some variation and mottling will add to the depth of the finish and create for a far more interesting model. Once the khaki drab has been sprayed and allowed to dry overnight, it's time to start masking up the areas where I want that colour to remain. Following the reference scheme I'd printed, the shapes are dropped over the model in the appropriate areas. I'm sure you can start to see why trying to keep the model as flat and simple as I possibly could was important in order to get this scheme to work. Unfortunately, doing 80% of the paint work and then trying to continue this build isn't the smartest idea in the world, but it was the only way I felt I could get this scheme to work. The masking looks like a little bit of a dog's breakfast here, but with any luck, the majority of the tape will hold in place. For irregular shapes or problem areas, a small blob of blue tack is used to hold the mask in place.
What a dog's breakfast.
The same paint mix that I used to paint the wheels in the last video is mixed up and sprayed on the model now. Loosely speaking, it was around 80% desert yellow with 20% white. Spraying this colour on the Khaki Drab will inevitably darken the colour, but that is okay as it will allow me to create interesting mottled tones and finishes in the paint. It's pretty much like the black basing method, but I'm using the drab base colour to create my variation and tones. By doing this, the tones of the Khaki Drab and the sand should be in harmony and work really well together on the finished model. Random imperfect spraying patterns allow me to create the tones and the layers. Painting in small defined areas allows the application to be created in a thoughtful way. By remaining bound to this small area as shown on the screen, I'm able to keep movement in the airbrush and the model to a minimum and build up the layer in a predictable way. The sand colour mix is then lightened a little further with a touch of white to the mix whilst the paint is still in the cup of the airbrush. I then use that mix to create even greater depth in the sandy tones. Coverage is kept to a minimum and applied in an even more random way. However, I'm focusing on the horizontal surfaces and generally speaking the centers of the panels. You can really start to see the depth the lighter sand tone is creating the colour, and it's a terrific way to create life in monotone schemes, although this one will come to life once the masks are removed. Creating shades and highlights using the airbrush is not only so easy once you get a feel for thinning ratios and how the paint is working, but it is one of the steps in the modelling process I enjoy the most. As a general rule, the lighter you go with your highlights, the less the coverage should be. Just have a bit of fun with it. And then to one of the most nerve-wracking but easily one of the most rewarding stages in any masking project, removing the masks. Nerve-wracking in the fact that often there can be issues with bleeding, especially when trying to mask straight lines over irregular surfaces, but I'm confident I'm not going to have any issues with the masks removing paint because 1, the model was prepared and primed prior to painting, and 2, I'm using lacquer paints that will give me a predictable, hard-wearing bond to the surface on which they are being sprayed. The tape masks for the tracks are then removed and I finally get a sneak peek at where all those hours of preparation and masking went to. I was really happy with how it was looking and encouraged by the results. Once I'd removed the masks, I'd noted in reference pictures that I was missing 2 quite significant colour blocks on the frontal armour. I'd missed them when looking at the Vespid colour scheme, but you can clearly see them in reference pictures, so I had to address it, and it was back to the masking station. There are also a number of imperfections around the model where the lines of the masks didn't quite line up, so these were addressed at this stage, plus I'd neglected to mask the undersides of the side armour, but that was an easy fix. Painting the white over the sand will tend to make it look a little different to the other white patches around the model, just because of the base that the colour was being built from. But I wasn't too worried about that because weathering and washes will tend to unite any differences. Once the white was dry, the missing Khaki Drab panel was also sprayed in place. With the bulk of the masking and shapes formed over the model, it was now time to start adding the details around the engine deck. I'd removed the molded grab handles in the last video, so they were now going to be replaced using copper wire. The handles are bent into the appropriate shape and size using some Meng etch pliers. Attaching them is just a matter of a small amount of super glue to each side and then seating them in the holes I'd pre-drilled in the previous video. I'm able to use the thickness of the tweezers to give me the spacing of the handle. That will ensure the handles are all sitting around the same position around the various locations on the model. The handles can then be painted. Painting direct to metal can be problematic, but because I'm using lacquers, it should be okay for what I'm doing. The kit comes with a strand of metal wire for the tow cable. The cable is then cut into the lengths using an old pair of sprue cutters, and whatever you do, don't use your good sprue cutters for this job because it will completely destroy them.
Do it.
The metal cable can then be dipped into the AK burnishing fluid for around 20 seconds, resulting in the metal part turning a greyish black colour. I really like the colour as it is, but by burnishing it, I'm also going to be allowing it to take any layers of subsequent paint or weathering that will follow. All of the various tools and bits and pieces are first painted in a base colour, and then further detail is added by brush painting them. Basic chipping is added to the parts using a sponge chipping method, and in reality the tools should be pretty clean on a vehicle like this, but it was hard for me to hold back here. With everything pre-painted, it was then just a matter of attaching the various bits and pieces around the model. Trying to attach the pre-painted parts using a regular modelling cement is problematic because it taints the paint, so super glue is used at this stage. This is the downside of building and painting like this. Trying to attach parts to a painted model is never a good idea, and I learnt the hard way that super glue remover is an excellent paint remover too, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. The two blocks of the side armour are also glued in place at this stage, giving the tank that bulky look that attracted it to me in the first place. And then the skirts at the rear are attached to finish the look of the sides perfectly. The model then received a couple of coats of Tamiya semi-gloss clear and was set aside to dry. It was then time to add a pin wash to the model and really bring it to life. Using a flat brush, I first coat the surfaces in a liberal coating of white spirit. This layer will prepare the surface for the paint that will follow and should help the flow and the way the paint behaves. Now, if there was one technique that elevates the look of a model instantly, it would have to be a pin wash. The semi-gloss clear I've applied over the model will give me the perfect foundation to build and refine the washes on the model. I tried a couple of different colours but found the brown wash for Africa Core vehicles seemed to work the best with the three-tone colour scheme. The wash is applied in a methodical way and I'm working on small sections around the model. This will ensure nothing gets missed, but it will also mean that if I get called away from the modelling bench, I can quickly finish the section without fear of it tainting the paint. Touching the brush loaded with the enamel paint around recesses and details allows the paint to migrate to the parts through capillary action. It's inevitable that there will be a little mess that will need to be tidied up. However, this is an easy process using either a makeup sponge if the paint hasn't had too long to dry, or a brush moistened with white spirit quickly and easily clears up the imperfections and blends them into the model. While I'm working on the cleanup effort, I'm also able to use this time to create some subtle streaking effects, as well as clean up any excess wash. By using a flat brush moistened with white spirit and moving the paint in a downward motion, I'm creating realistic subtle streaking, as well as toning down the volume of the paint around those rivets and recesses. Once the initial round of washes had dried, a generous layer of VMS matte varnish is applied over the model. I'm able to confidently flood the surface with this varnish due to its excellent self-leveling properties. It's a real game changer. And after that mammoth masking effort and paint work, I think that's a good place to wrap this episode up. I'd always had grand plans for this leopard and wanted to do something special with the paintwork. Executing an urban camouflage scheme like this can look reasonably simple on paper, but it can be very easy to underestimate the time, effort, and planning that goes into pulling it off. Having faith in the process and the integrity of the paint is imperative to keep the motivation up through this build, because the work can become quite tedious. It is, however, always incredibly rewarding when you start pulling back those masks and reveal the fruits of your labour and end up with something so unique. But it's still far from done, so in the next video in this leopard series, I'll be looking to tidy up some of the loose ends around the model, as well as looking to add some depth with oil paints, and then of course it will be on to the dusting and weathering effects to truly bring this street fighting leopard to life. If I've added some value today, please smash that like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already, and be sure to join in the comments below. Good, bad or indifferent, it helps me a lot to grow this channel and reach a greater audience. Remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family, share it with your friends, connect with community, and let's be proud of what we do. It's so important. Until next time, I'll see you soon.